So next, I want to hit probably two examples of what the same activity looks like at three different stages of growth. So as we dive into that, maybe that'll help explain some things. So I think the first step is project management, just the both the function of project management and the role, because those are two different things. When you're small, it's really not even a role. When you're small, it's likely the owner is handling all of it, and there's very little project management requirements just due to the nature and the size of the projects. And then let's say at that scalable foundation size around 150 people, that's the stage where we call it scalable foundation, because you, for the major functions in the company, which is usually the get work, the estimating function, the project management function, and accounting, you start to have some pretty clear expectations for what the PMs need to do, but they still have very little support. They're generalists and they're doing a little bit of everything. They're doing some estimating, they're doing some purchasing, and they have some systems and tools, but the use is totally inconsistent. So that's normal. That's exactly what they should be doing at that stage. And when you move over to stage 6 plus, you've now taken that project management function and you've broken it down into somewhere between 4 to 6 very distinct roles, from project executive through project engineer, project coordinator level, people. They make up the total project management function. They have clear career paths and training for each role. That a lot of that training involves cross training for other roles. So that management trainee program will include 6 months in estimating or a year in estimating to learn those skills and learn how everything integrates. They have really robust support functions, coming from estimating, purchasing, contracts, virtual construction, fabrication. And so it's really narrowed the scope of what the PM is expected to do, and at the same time specialized it into multiple roles. And then they have both clear outcome and process expectations, not just what's expected for them to achieve, but how they're expected to achieve it. As you mentioned, the checklist. Anybody doesn't know, Sue is a checklist queen. She loves checklists. Don't ever mistake a checklist from an action item list in front of Sue. It's not a good look. So but this is the progression that's going on, and it's interesting. We have several clients right now that are going through specifically with the PMs and adding in centralized purchasing, and that's something that usually happens in between stage 4 and 5. And that's not a hard and fast rule. Some companies might have integrated that function earlier. A lot of that just depends on the dynamics of the business and the leadership. But many times it happens for between stage 4 and 5 that they centralize, how that buyout and how that procurement is happening. And it's super interesting. If you watch a project, like I came from a company that had done centralized purchasing starting very early. So to me, I didn't know anything else. That was a shock to me when I got out and started consulting in 2005 and realizing how many contractors didn't have that. So I never knew anything besides calling somebody up and saying, "Hey, I need X, Y, and Z." They knew what the requirements on the job were. They knew the specs. They knew that, what was approved from a submittal standpoint, and it just magically showed up. And I think that's the coolest thing ever as a project manager or superintendent. And it's so interesting because then I'm realizing that you get into a company where the project manager, the superintendent, or both are directly responsible for ordering the material, including the vendor management and all aspects of it. And they look at it like it's not a benefit to have, a purchasing, agent. They look at it like, why would you take that control from me? I need that control to run the job. So this gets into our first floor and ceiling. So what have you seen within the project management function now within your career, Sue?
Well, it's very interesting because the before consulting, right? When I was actually, working for a general or a prime contractor, it's funny, right? As a 6 plus, right? Big company. Uh, Funny thing there, we did not have centralized purchasing. And I tell you, tough trying to it's tough trying to change a culture that when you look at, I mean, you look at this 6 plus, right? And the sustainable scaling. That is, the project manager is responsible for basically everything on that job. And uh distinct roles that have been, project engineer, field engineer, all these roles that work and report up through the project manager. When you talk about purchasing, that purchasing was always done on the job. When you've structured it that long or that way for so long, and now you try to implement a centralized purchasing module, it can get a little crazy because, again, it is exactly like you said, David. It is project manager wondering, how can you take this control away from me? Even though central purchasing in this case, right, can save a lot of money, things like that. And you do have to plan ahead for things like that. Yet, some of the projects I'd worked around, we had to plan 4, 5, 6 months in advance to package up barges to send them to Alaska. And you had to package them in such a way that the right things would come off at the right time. So it's not like planning and scheduling wasn't our thing, but it was that loss of control. So it is interesting going from that, the startup in one, because now consulting and working with some of those smaller kind of startup type companies, it's difficult to go from a one to a four, right? To go from that starting up to that scalable foundation, because you're used to having the purchase order book in your pocket. You're used to knowing every dollar that goes out the door, and you measure things in dollars and cents. As you move up to that four and you become scalable, you start to round, right? You start rounding to the nearest thousand, maybe the nearest 10,000. Then
Right.
you're getting to the fives and sixes, and now you're rounding to the nearest million. So that it just kind of again explains the level of changes. But you're right. In the scalable foundation, that project manager kind of does everything, knows everything, and can ask all the questions because they pretty much know everything that's going on. When you start to get on that bigger work and you start to get with those bigger organizations, you really do have to trust the people below you. And that, it's a different skill level. It's a different skill level going from, through a level four where you're doing it all yourself. You're doing a lot, you're doing it all yourself, to that five or six where now you're not doing it yourself. You're doing it through others who are doing that work. And
Yeah.
that, yeah, that's a whole different, a whole different skill that needs to be taught and figured out if this is what somebody really, really wants to do.
So I was using the analogy the other day with somebody on, it's kind of like the difference between basketball is basketball, except you train very differently. If I'm training to, this is a horrible analogy for you and me. So, because I don't even like basketball and I'm definitely no good at it. I don't know about you, but if we're training for a one-on-one game, it's still dribbling, shooting, blocking. It's all of the basics, but we would train much differently to play one-on-one versus playing as a team, because as a team, you have to play so much and passing the ball around and having that perfect situational awareness to simply know that, okay, if I'm in this position and the rest of the people are here, I know that I've got 3 or 4 teammates that are behind me. And if I just throw the ball, they will retrieve it and they will, they're going to run their play exactly as they should. And that's a very different training, when you get down to it, because it comes down to the handoff. So I think, the important piece, and there's 100 of these different. This is probably the beginning of our floors and ceilings and all of that discussion. And there's 100 different growth points that you go through as a contractor. We're just giving an example of the project management. And it's important to look at it and go, each one of these, each level of structure is totally appropriate for the stage of growth. You couldn't take the 6+ structure and bolt it onto a number two, size company.
Right.
You can do something slightly out of order, like you might centralize purchasing, much earlier in the process. But even with the centralized purchasing, let's say you get into that scalable foundation and you've centralized purchasing, everything else the PM is doing is still there. It's very much a generalist role. It's single accountability. It's pretty simple. There's a lot of inconsistencies and things like that. So you're always progressing towards specialization and towards consistency is what you're progressing towards. So let's hit one more example of foreman, out on the job, short interval planning. That's your, different companies, anywhere from a 1 week look ahead to a 3 week look ahead schedule. And that this is where the action really happens. I mean, most of productivity happens on that short interval plan and the ability to actually get the task done that we plan to get done. So when you're starting up, that's pretty much like, what is that? Projects likely don't require one. If the owner of that company came from a larger organization and started up, they may actually use that tool on the projects. That looks very different. Whether somebody came from a higher level role at a larger company and then started the business, or somebody took, what I call like the craftsman route and was, a great carpenter or a great electrician or, plumber, and then started up their business from there, just coming straight out of the field. Those two startups look a little bit different, but likely the projects you're working on, they just simply don't require one, and you got it all in your head. So then you get up to that scalable foundation, the 150, person range, and there's definitely clear expectations. At this point, we've realized all the problems. Foreman's got to do the short interval plan. The foreman, and they use it a lot of times to communicate their field workforce needs on the project to their supervisor, be that depending on how they're structured, a superintendent or a ops manager, or just directly to the project manager. And that's primarily where the tool is used. It's very inconsistent in the use and formats. What was the last time? What was that company? How many formats did they find when we finally started to get to standardizing this? What do you find? Like 15 different formats across the company, and that was only for one scope of work. they,
Yeah, yeah.
they
It's
did
like,
like 3 or 4 different scopes of work, and just within the one scope of work, there was a bunch of different formats of short interval plans.
yeah,
So it gets back to the inconsistent use. And that's not just on the formats. Then there's also the workflow of where does that tool go and how is it used for feedback.
right.
So then you get all the way over to kind of the 6 plus, and they, usually at that stage, they're tasking the project in the very beginning at the planning phase. So the tasks are already predetermined. Those tasks happen to be tied to the estimate in terms of cost, budget, schedule, all that. They're tied into the virtual construction or any design support required, purchasing, fabrication. It's kind of cool. So you start the project, you got a big long task list and everything. So now it's a matter of just sequencing those tasks based on what's required. Material lead times and labor are roughly aligned at that early planning stage before boots ever touch the ground with the project schedule. And then they have it's fully integrated with a field labor dispatch system or an equipment dispatch system, depending on the contractor, and production feedback system. And there's a weekly review and escalation process. So you actually have, the foreman's manager looking at the weekly plan, going, okay, this is the plan, challenging them, asking the different questions, making sure it's good, looking at it afterwards and saying, did we get done what we said we were going to get done? Clear escalation process if the work's interrupted, work areas aren't ready, waiting on other trades, anything like that. So that's a pretty dramatic difference between a 1 and a 6. So, and I know early on, so this is also a funny piece, is early on in with the consulting business, in so going back to 2005, 2006, one of the very first training modules we developed was labor productivity. And it was interesting because we were in a few workshops where there would be some Keywood employees in there, and it was so interesting watching the difference in the room, because you start to talk about task planning and having all your prerequisites met and everything like that, and you have literally a whole class full of people. And I was noticing this, and this is before I'd done some sub work for Keywip. This way before meeting you. And the rest of the class is sitting there taking notes viciously. And some people, there's always like the 2 or 3. They're like, why do you need to plan? The world just happens. And then there's like the middle of the class that's taking notes and really thinking about it. And then the people from Kiewit or that had come from Kiewit are looking at going, why would you ever start a task if you didn't have everything ready? Like, you're a useless teacher.
Yeah. Well, but you're right? That is really when we go back to the very beginning of this, right? Talking about the size of the organizations and talking about just what the organization has done for so long. Um, I tell you that with me, right? Again, the Kiewit people that totally understand how to put a schedule together, what that schedule should look like. You need to include your subcontractors on that schedule. That also means you need to make sure that they've got their proof of insurance, that everything that's there, your equipment, any equipment you're going to take out for maintenance during the week. What does that mean? How do you get something else in there? But I mean, all of that is thought through on a very large wall in the conference room, or several walls in the conference room. But it is literally the culture of doing that. And again, so moving from, that 6+ contractor, and knowing that you've got all that, and going to someone who is trying to grow to something like that, right? But that might be a stage 3 or stage 4. There's a lot of backing up you have to do, because you can't just implement all these, like you said, taking the 6+ processes and try to bolt them onto a 3, that 3 size contractor just doesn't work. There's there's training that has to go with that. There's a bit of a culture change. There's literal behavioral management that needs to happen to be able to put that in, because people have to understand that this is the new way, and this is what you're going to do and going to continue to do. Um, and it's hard. And back to the safety discussion we were having a little earlier. I'm used to walking on a job and everything is in its place. I mean, everything is in its place. There's not a piece of trash on the ground. And well, you remember we were on a job site tour
Yeah.
together, and walked out there, and there were a bunch of cords laying on the ground.
Thought
And
you were going to have cardiac arrest on the
yeah,
spot.
I got to the top of the stairs and looked at it. I was almost paralyzed. I almost couldn't move. I'm like, what do you do with all these cords on the ground? Somebody's going to get hurt. And it took me a minute. Actually, it took David, you explaining it to me, that yeah, my floor was so high on safety. I couldn't even imagine that this was okay. And yet, for the contractor that was out there, this was great. They had really cleaned things up, and this was 100% better than it had been a couple of months ago. And so just the difference between what my expectation is when I go out there, and someone else's expectation that maybe hasn't lived the life that I lived. It's sometimes it's tough to realize, hey, you do have to meet people where they are and help them to see beyond that. But
And,
yeah,
and for context, that was a job that was a 20-story,
yeah,
building. There was probably, peak headcount out there in the 500-ish person range for all trades. It from my experience, kind of looking up the mountain, it looked like a pretty darn clean job site. I mean, it wasn't perfect, and yet you were having a complete, like, oh no, they could do this and they could do this and they could do this. Your situational awareness of the details that you saw, as compared to what I saw, what our client was seeing, were just completely different. And so it was a perfect example of floors and ceilings.
yeah, yeah,
So in this one, this is an interesting one that I like this example of short interval planning, because unlike the what we just went through with the project management function, this is one that a lot of elements of these kind of best practices that are in this 6+ site, size contractor, can be pulled all the way back to a much smaller contractor, to somebody even in the 3 or 4 range. Maybe not the whole of the integrated technology systems, but in terms of just how to work through this process. And because this is such a crucial process, and to give an example of it, this is a whole foundation of, like, the Lean Construction Institute, is that they did studies of short interval plans, and they found that a typical project for any typical specialty contractor, their weekly work plan, only about half the activities happened as planned, not because the particular specialty contractor wasn't doing their job, just because the work area wasn't ready, or labor wasn't available, or material wasn't available. Something occurred, doesn't matter what it was, but they only accomplished about 54% of the task as they planned them for the week. Doesn't mean they weren't busy for the week or anything, just they didn't do it as planned. And then if they only focused on that one metric of just making sure that the weekly work plan happened as best possible, the way it was planned, you're always going to have rain days and things like that. Once it got into the 85% or above range as an average for the week, the projects as a whole performed dramatically better on all aspects, from quality to safety to overall project duration to profitability. So this gets me back to, after my recognition and 2006, 2007 of doing a lot of labor productivity workshops, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and then watching the difference between the younger project engineers, project managers, foremen, superintendents that were in those classes that came from companies that like Keywood, or you guys have a kind of a lineage of some other contractors that you spawned and things like that, and seeing how they thought dramatically different about project planning and task planning. Then I think I was probably 2008, 2009. I'm in Las Vegas. I'm at an industry conference and I'm doing that same labor productivity workshop. And I was just kind of going around the room and everybody introduce yourself. And about the third or fourth guy that introduced himself, he made some pretty derogatory comment about, I'm on this stupid, and I'm not going to use any of the other words that he used, but big, I think it was a water treatment plant with Kiewit, and they forced me to do this and this and this paperwork, and he's and they do this and they do that, and he was basically talking about the bureaucratic business management system that they had in place, which that's what now I know, knowing you, that was within your region that you were responsible for. So you were the business manager, you were forcing these bureaucratic processes. So I'm going, and then I hear three or four other contractors throughout the room. I think there's probably 60, 80 people in the room. They started to pipe up, and I'm going, wow, it's like 7 minutes into this class, I've already lost control. I haven't even started. I'm on the intro slide. And so then I asked the one question that I was hoping we do. Well, how's the project going? Oh, project's going great. It's ahead of schedule. How are you doing on the project? Oh, we're making plenty of money. We're doing great.
Yeah.
So, but it was funny because I want to, I want to say they were in the 50-ish person range. So they were in that, stage 3, probably emerging from stage 2. And he didn't fully understand it, but you had an overall subcontractor management system where you enforce some of those basic processes and procedures down about planning and safety and quality control and such. And it was interesting, but he kind of paused and he thought about it, and then at least he was quiet for the rest of the class, and I was able to get through it. But it was just interesting, and I always wonder if I could go back. Did he really pull in the cause and effect of that? Or
Right.
not. So I'm super interested to hear, later on about how you drove some of those processes down to really manage the subcontractors, and therefore help pull them up and help grow them over time.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it,
And that is one reason, right? When a lot of people say, hey, the generals tend to hire the same subs. It's like, well, the ones that understand what you're doing just make life that much easier, right? If you're going to do the processes that you've done before and you get it, makes it that much easier for the prime's life.
yeah. So, and again, back to this is the same thing. Every level of system, totally appropriate for the stage of growth. It's knowing an objective evaluation of where you happen to be at in your stage of growth, where you're growing towards, and
Yeah.
then where your systems and your structures and everything happen to be. So this is not a one size fits all.